In the previous videos of this series, we saw different ways to find the GameObjects in the hierarchy or some component that these GameObjects may have assigned, but in all those cases we knew that the GameObject was there or had a certain tag, a certain name, a certain component assigned to it. We were sure about that. In certain situations we try to find the reference of an object that may not even exist in the scene and apply different actions if you found it or not. In those cases, we would have to prepare the code so that it behaves properly and doesn't give errors in the console. Notice these 4 instructions. Here I'm looking for the reference of a GameObject that has this name. In the corner I leave you the video where we saw how to do it. Notice that in the hierarchy we have a GameObject that is called that way, so in this variable we're going to have this object assigned. Then we print its name in the console, that is, we are using the reference of the object to apply some action to it. In this case, to read one of its internal values, which is the name. If this reference was null, because we didn't find any object with that name, here we will have a NullReferenceException error. In the third instruction, we obtain the audio source component of this GameObject. We saw this in the previous video, I leave it here in the corner. And the fourth action is to print the volume of this audio source component in the console. Here, when entering the game mode, we see that the references are assigned, we have the GameObject, we have the audio source component, and we see the messages in the console, the name of the GameObject and the volume of the audio source. Here, if you notice, the volume is equal to 1. So, all this is working. But what would happen if here I mistype the name, for example? Now this object will not be found, and here we will have an error because this field is null and we're trying to use it, and the rest of the code will not be executed because when an error happens, Unity makes a break and the execution of the current function is interrupted at that point. Look, this is interesting. Here I wrote the name correctly, so we will be able to find the reference of the object. I print the number 1 in the console, then print the name of the object, and then print the number 2. Press play, and here we see all those messages in the console. The number 1, the name of the object, and the number 2. If I write the name wrong, here the object is not gonna be found, and when we use it, we will get a runtime error. Notice that if I enter in the game mode, here in the console appears the number 1 and then the NullReferenceException error, which is telling us that all the code that was before the error was executed, and when the error happened, everything that was below was no longer executed. Unity will try to go ahead with the game despite the errors, but if you have these runtime errors, the behavior of the scripts becomes unpredictable. So you must pay attention to these runtime errors in the console and solve them. Now I'm gonna stop messing around and show you the 2 ways to prevent the code from executing if we don't have the references. One thing we can do is to define an if statement whose condition is the state of the object. Here, if the object exists, this instruction will be executed. But if the object doesn't exist, the instruction will not be executed. Look, I press play, the object isn't found, but there are no errors in the console. If I write the name correctly, I press play, here the object is found and the name is printed in the console. So in this way we are avoiding those null reference exceptions, and it works for GameObjects and components. We can write the condition so, but I prefer to write it this way, audio player different from null, because otherwise it seems as if audio player was a boolean variable, and it's not, it's a GameObject type variable. The second way is for the components. Here what we are doing is reading the audio source component that is assigned to this GameObject. But what would happen if there is no audio source component assigned? This field will be null, and when we try to use it, we will get an error. So, to begin with, this is something we would have to do inside this if statement. Only if the audio player object isn't null, then we try to read the audio source component attached to it. But getting the component can also be done this way. Here, using the object reference, instead of GetComponent, there is a function called TryGetComponent. Try to get the audio source component. Here, between parentheses, we have to put the output parameter, that is an audio source variable where the component will be stored if it's found, and otherwise the variable will not be assigned. And also, this instruction returns a boolean. If it succeeds, it returns true. If it doesn't succeed, it returns false. So here we can write out and indicate the variable where we want to store the component if found, and as all this instruction returns a boolean, we can use it as a condition for an if statement. If all this is true, then we do this. I'm gonna enter the play mode. We have the two variables assigned and we have the messages in the console. If the audio source component wasn't assigned to the object and we enter the game mode, here we see that the game object is found, the audio source component isn't found, but we don't have any errors in the console. That is, this part of the code is not being executed.